Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I am so delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as those of you who are here in person tonight. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We thank you all for taking a moment to silence your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. When the Q&A starts, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. Occasionally, not always, but occasionally, the stars align here at the JFK Library, and tonight is one of those moments. This year, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of President Kennedy's landmark challenge to the country to land a man on the moon within a decade. That speech was delivered at Rice University, the preeminent university from which our guest of honor tonight, Doug Brinkley, hails. Doug, as many of you know, has written what I would consider the definitive book on the history of President Kennedy's moonshot, the unprecedented call to action that dramatically reimagined the capacity of individuals driven by creativity and purpose to change the world. But there's more serendipity to this story. As part of our celebration of the 60th anniversary of the speech, the JFK Library Foundation has partnered with Prince William's Earthshot Prize, which was inspired by President Kennedy's moonshot, to incentivize global urgent optimism and action to help repair the planet within this decade. The prize itself is a form of the modern environmental activism that, as Doug has described in his book, has its roots in the Silent Spring Revolution and is a notable part of the legacy of President Kennedy's administration. And so we have come full circle and learned along the way that all roads here lead back to Doug Brinkley. With that, you know why we are especially grateful tonight to have this timely opportunity to explore the rise of environmental activism with our distinguished guests. I'm now delighted to officially introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so glad to extend a warm welcome back to the library to Douglas Brinkley. He is the Catherine Sanoff Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, a CNN presidential historian, the presidential historian for the New York Historical Society, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He works in many capacities in the world of public history, including for museums, colleges, and historical societies. 6 of his books were named New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and 7 became New York Times bestsellers. His new book is Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, and the Great Environmental Awakening. And I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator for this evening, Michael Eric Dyson, to the library. The distinguished university professor of African American and Diaspora Studies and of Ethics and Society and NEH Centennial Chair at Vanderbilt University, he is an award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of over 25 books, a prominent public intellectual, an ordained Baptist minister, and a noted political analyst. He is a 2-time NAACP Image Award winner and the winner of the American Book Award for Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina, and the Color of Disaster. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you so kindly. What a wonderful opportunity it is to be here with one of the leading thinkers, not only presidential historians, but American historians, and a great bon vivant conversationalist and a raconteur second to none. We're going to be speaking about the tension between Heisenberg and Einstein on the unified field theory. And we're going to talk about quantum mechanics in the relief. If we've got time, we'll get to the environment as well. But Doug Brinkley could write about that with aplomb. Let's get right to it. The title of the book, right, is itself embracing, both in the main title, Silent Spring Revolution, but even acknowledging Rachel Carson, along with Kennedy and LBJ. Nixon didn't have enough room to squeeze up in there, perhaps as you outlined in the book, both embracing and then returning fire against conservatism and conservationism and the environmental movement. But in terms of echoing a classic American text in what is bound to be another classic American text, not just literary allusion, but to embrace Rachel Carson and to talk about at once a controversial but monumentally important figure. Speak to us then about why this book now, that title informing the extraordinary range of sources you have in this book, the ideas you have, merely to talk to us about the threat, the existential and ecological threat to our lives. Talk about that title and your embrace of that classic and how you both echo it, but also extend it.
Well, how great is it for me to have Michael Eric Dyson here, guys, to be able to be the person. I just adore him as a person and as a philosopher and as a thinker and as a force of good. I wrote there have been three progressive movements on the environment. Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909. And he saved 234 million acres of wild America. He created the Department of Forestry, National Forest Service. Look at a map of the West. You see all these green forests, TR. But that was a different kind of preservation that he was doing. But nevertheless, it had characters in it like John Muir and the Sierra Club, on and on. The second wave was FDR and the Great Depression, because we had so much our agricultural runoff. We had a dust bowl. We had denuded landscapes. There weren't even a Canada goose to be found on the Atlantic seaboard. All these species were going extinct, and FDR does mainly what TR did about preservation, but he started expanding it, and one of his expansions was creating a place called Pawtuxet in Maryland. And there, under FDR to today, our good public employees of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are testing contaminants that might damage people if they are consumed, or they're testing what happens if you put a chemical in a creek, what happens if you are eating a wrong foodstuff. They're doing unsung heroes working government in the bureaucracy. And so FDR is kind of a turning point. And his Civilian Conservation Corps planted nearly 3 billion trees in that period. I'm writing about the third wave. So this is a trilogy for me in the end. And the third wave is really is 1960 to 1973. I begin my book in 1950 or 1945 because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and that nuclear age. And while we won the war with nuclear weapons, and DDT was being sprayed on people like John F. Kennedy going to the Pacific to not have lice or to be bitten by mosquitoes and catch a malarial disease. After World War II, we started doing tests at Pawtuxet and elsewhere. A man named Barry Commoner, I don't know if you remember him, but he was starting to do it and said, these genies of atomic bombs and things like DDT aren't good for human existence in their current configurations. Right. And we were blowing up bombs willy-nilly in the Nevada desert. From 1945 to 1992, the United States detonated 1,054 nuclear bombs. So that's part of that movement of environment was nuclear fallout concerns. When Bob Dylan's writing Blowing in the Wind or Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, there were all the stories. Kurt Vonnegut was worried about it, nuclear. And Rachel Carson had the nerve. She worked in World War II at Pawtuxet, was a New Dealer. She combined ocean science, conservation, and wrote beautiful books that won awards like you just did. And she's winning award after award for her books. And then she got the raw data on DDT and dying of cancer herself. Breast cancer, she's going through radiation treatment. She started in the late 50s, early 60s, writing a seismic book called Silent Spring, which is a lot like a Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin or Thomas Paine's Common Sense, or Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle about meat packing factories. The book exploded, and it made people know, time out. We now are the new environmental work isn't just about saving places, it's about public health. Right. And are we getting sick in our own backyard through contaminants? And you've written so brilliantly, Michael, on Martin Luther King in your life. It's Dr. King. Coretta Scott King protested the anti-nuclear testing all the time. But Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, what good does it do to integrate the lunch counter in Greensboro, and elsewhere, if the milk we're drinking is contaminated with strontium-90, fallout? Right. And so I try to deal with this in the book. And Carson dies in 1964. DDT's not banned till 1972, but it was a grassroots awakening, this third wave. And I come to you today with Michael here. We're waiting for the fourth wave. We thought Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth with climate. The fourth wave's got to be global immediately. It deals with fossil fuels, climate justice, and we're not there yet. So I'm hoping this book shows how a generation of people like Dr. King or Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta out west protesting pesticides, how William O. Douglas used the Supreme Court to wake people up, how Mrs. Sorensen's here, and how her husband, Ted Sorensen, helped convince people, Kennedy and Norman, and to ban nuclear testing with the famous nuclear test ban treaty. With Ted's work on that, I didn't know till I did this book. And for him to go weigh in like he did about the dangers, ecological dangers of nuclear testing, and convince the president to, move forward and do something like that. There were all these players. And so it's in many ways, I'm celebrating a lot of these thinkers and intellectuals of that era, activists, who gave us the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, who created the EPA, NEPA laws, in addition to urban wilderness, and started creating the idea of environmental justice. And it was all in this 60s, what I call long 60s, 1960 to 73. 73, the movement starts getting hit because of the oil embargo, and people are worried about pumping at the gas stations and inflation. And so Rachel Carson's sort of the main figure. The other books were presidents. This one is about Rachel Carson, but Kennedy's embrace of her was very significant.
No, that's a beautiful genealogy. Nietzsche and Foucault would be proud of how you condensed the sweep, the sweep of both, environmental catastrophe and the response to it, and seeing the relationship. And I want to dig into that in a minute. But first, something you mentioned is fascinating. Now, we have a different kind of ecological devastation, an orange apparition, which has beclouded the horizon of American politics, right? I can safely say that in Massachusetts, maybe. But speaking of presidents and the way in which they wielded the bully pulpit from TR on, but talk to us, because I was fascinated in your book. I made perhaps an uncharitable allusion in my opening comments to Nixon, but Nixon was an important player here with Kennedy, LBJ, and Nixon. We're used to hearing about them in regard to civil rights and the struggle over that. and the way in which, say, Nixon ended up using affirmative action to break the backs of unions, not necessarily for a charitable intent. But you brilliantly lay out here stuff I never knew in regard to these presidents. Just very briefly, if you could talk about Kennedy, LBJ, and Nixon, and why they were extremely important during the long 60s that you document.
John F. Kennedy was much more influential in my writing and on conservation than I think he's been given credit for. Why? He grew up, as you know, his mother, Rose Kennedy, grew up in Concord. And she loved Henry David Thoreau, not just the Thoreau of civil disobedience, but Thoreau of Walden Pond. So the Kennedy kids, including John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, they learned to swim in Walden Pond. Wow. They would travel from Hyannisburg, Boston, swim in Walden Pond as if to baptismal. Rose Kennedy, this almost sounds apocryphal, but it's not. Rose Kennedy went on a secret mission to Russia. I'm getting somebody nodding who knows the story. And she went with the CIA to get her there to make sure Russian libraries were carrying Thoreau's books. Henry David Thoreau also wrote a book called Cape Cod, which I recommend to you. It's not considered a classic, so it gets forgotten, but it's good. And so she was the one. And Rose ended up loving seashore life. And Jack Kennedy learned to swim, learned to sail, as you all know. And the library's built here because of his love and affection for water and the sea. But in the 50s, Rachel Carson wrote her famous 3-book trilogy, starting in the one came out in 1941 about the sea wind, but then she wrote The Sea Around Us and all 3 books in a row. And Rose Kennedy loved them. And Jack Kennedy decided that as a senator, he wasn't a workhorse senator, Kennedy. He did grab on to seashore preservation in a very profound way because he saw that we were losing all of our public beaches. And if you were somebody that didn't have money or you wanted to study nature or for ecological reasons, we needed to protect some. So he saved Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961 as president, which is unique because Kennedy created a national park where people live. Truro, Wellfleet, Provincetown could be surrounded by the national park. You don't have to just put it aside like Theodore Roosevelt fashion. And they did Padre Island, Texas. And they did Point Reyes National Seashore in California. These are prime real estate areas being protected as open space. In addition to that, Kennedy got very interested in a man named Norman Cousins, who wrote for Saturday Literary Review, and Cousins was opposed to Nagasaki. Joe Kennedy, the father, was opposed to Nagasaki. He went to go see Henry Luce, and he went to go find the Catholic bishop to say no more atomic bombs. Unlikely guy, you would think, to be that way, but he was. And Ted Sorensen was opposed to all war, period, conscientious objector, his closest friend, an advisor and speechwriter. And Kennedy didn't like the nuclear chemical world that we were building. And he was open-minded enough to listen to sane people protesting against nuclear. I mean, here's President of the United States calling citizens, for peace, women fighting. He was so impressed with these women picketing to stop nuclear weapons. And so in Kennedy's effect, the New Frontier, he put Stuart Udall in as Secretary of Interior. He made lists of places to save, like the Indiana Dunes outside of Chicago or Apostle Islands, Wisconsin. And Udall wrote a book called The Quiet Crisis. Kennedy wrote the beginning of it. And they were conscious they were igniting a third wave, a new environmental wave. Kennedy's killed. LBJ takes it over. And LBJ had a different love of the land. He loved the Texas Hill Country, Pedernales. And he got very interested in how people in urban areas, particularly the poor, how they can have outdoor recreation. Because if you don't have a big budget, you can't go driving out to Yosemite National Park and lodge. So Johnson, at his best, was promoting places near urban centers. He did Fire Island National Seashore, Assateague in Virginia, places that you can get to in a day's drive, not have to go halfway out to the west. But he also signed the Wilderness Act, which saved 9.1 million acres of land that's roadless to save for animals to have as sanctuaries. And Johnson did Wild and Scenic Rivers Acts. Now, the Vietnam War, it's kind of weird, Johnson doing all of this conservation stuff while we're doing Agent Orange in Vietnam, And it's one reason LBJ didn't get the credit on this aspect of, he was good on civil rights and really good on conservation also, but doesn't mean he's perfect on the 58,000 dead in Vietnam that we didn't need to be. But he is a tandem. Lady Bird Johnson. What's great about this book, I didn't have to be in vogue to put women, strong women. There is no writing about 60s environmentalism without Lady Bird Johnson and Rachel Carson. It has nothing to do with their gender per se. It has to do with their commitment. And they were, so I had the gift of these two women figures, and my estimation of Lady Bird's really got up. I did not know how well she wrote, how thoughtful she were. Her natural world epiphany was she grew up around Cato Lake on the Louisiana border and started learning her birds and the wildlife and the fauna. And of course, she promotes beautification, and she's trying to save historic zones from the wrecking ball of modernity, of ugly interstates that the Eisenhower system took over and was so she was aghast that Storyville in New Orleans, the neighborhood, got destroyed. She was aghast that Robert Moses built the Cross Bronx Expressway, destroying people's culture, and so it wasn't just nature for Lady Bird, it was about the cultural aspects in neighborhood and community parks. And yes, she also went with Stuart Udall down the Rio Grande River, and yes, she went in and gave the dedication at Redwood National Park and all. Today, there would be no Austin, Texas without what Lady Bird did. She saved Zilker Park, all the trail system, making it more of an urban, a great urban place to live. And then Nixon's a really reluctant environmentalist. But the thing is, guys, Nixon, and I do find as this is your spiritual side, I love, but he did have empathy. I don't think Donald Trump is capable of empathy. And I'm not saying that to give a dig in him or something. It's just imagine life with zero empathy. I mean, and Nixon, and I'm not saying having dogs proves empathy for creatures, but Nixon, like whale watching, he cared about wildlife a little more than I had realized for this or in seeing it. And of course, he lived on the ocean too. He lived in San Clemente. And Nixon's president days in the Santa Barbara oil spill hits, devastating that beautiful part of California in early 1969. And obviously Nixon's political guy first is like, don't blame me, I'm only here 8 days. This was Johnson's the one who did the leases, not me, which is fair enough. I mean, you can't blame somebody for a disaster like that when you're president a few days. But I looked at the NIMBY mail, the not in my backyard coming into California people, and Carmel and Dana Point and all, what's going on here? We bought our home on the California coast, and look at this. He heard that. He was California, he heard it, Nixon. And then that summer of '69, to his shock, when they were promoting Neil Armstrong going to the moon, lo and behold, Time magazine's putting covers of the Cuyahoga River on fire in Cleveland. And Mayor Stokes, the first leading black mayor, starts talking in today's language about environmental issues. It's not just the river on fire. The poor neighborhoods are dumping zones for all the toxic debris. And the combo of this starts with Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin who's created Earth Day. All the funding for Earth Day, this comes, guess who pays the bills for Earth Day? Remember, it was everything. Earth Day 1970, nonstop TV, offices suddenly in D.C. There was a sponsor named Walter Reuther, head of the United Auto Workers, connecting workers' rights to a clean environment. And Ruther, as Michael knows, helped Chavez, helped Dr. King, helped, he was a player in all of that change. And Nixon starts saying, damn it, I'm getting out environmental by the Democrats. And he had one person he hated Nixon, loathed, Ed Muskie of Maine. He was convinced Muskie was going to challenge him in '72. He was convinced that Muskie was marketeering himself, that he was a phony environmentalist, that he was showing himself in flannel shirts up in the Allagash in Maine and talking about how Nixon's a polluter. He loathed Muskie. And so Nixon tells William Ruckelshaus, and John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman of Watergate was the environmental lawyer from Seattle, Land and Water. Nixon, desperate, because the media is asking about the environment in '68, it's like, oh, ask John about that, just go down. Nixon did not care for this environmental stuff, but Ruckelshaus was a lawyer doing like stopping an aluminum plant in Seattle on the wealthy people not wanting these things in their neighborhoods.
Right.
And Ehrlichman was by David Brower of the Sierra Club. He called him a covert green. And Nixon said, I'll sign your environmental baloney if Muskie doesn't have his fingerprints on it and if it comes out of Scoop Jackson's office out in Washington State.
Right.
Scoop Jackson, the famous Democrat, Henry M. Jackson, senator from Boeing, he was called because he supported the Vietnam War too. And he never took to a microphone denouncing Nixon on the war.
Right.
And so if you're Nixon, you're saying, Muskie's denouncing my war strategy, Gaylord Nelson, George McGovern, Ted Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, at least Jackson's not. So I'll sign his legislative deals. So NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, that gives us our impact statements. If any of you want to go build, you got to have environmental impact. And the EPA, created by Nixon in the '70s, all really the handiwork coming out of Jackson's crackerjack Senate shop. And up until I looked at Henry Jackson, I always thought Ted Kennedy was unique in how great his staff was. Jackson had an incredible staff of environmental lawyers from the Pacific Northwest. And so really, up until the EPA, we had no sewage treatment plants that were federally regulated. I mean, it was game-changing. The federal government is now taking on the role of a cop, busting polluters. And Nixon deserves some credit for working with John Dingell of Michigan and with Scoop Jackson of Washington in getting that all-important federal agency going.
Right. No, that's thrilling. You do a great Nixon, by the way. Listening to those tapes. I'm not a good. So let's talk about, you mentioned, you alluded to, say, Huerta, Chavez, King, and so on. What I love about your book, and you mentioned about you didn't have to be in vogue vis-a-vis women, but you could be in L. And okay, that's, I'm working hard on these jokes up here. Y'all gonna have to give me a little bit more acknowledgement. But it's not simply a matter of politically correct historical reckoning and revisioning. It's about acknowledging the hidden elements, as you've already indicated, that were there. Women's work has always been marginalized, and therefore the centrality of their contribution in your narrative is indicative of a kind of rhetorical justice meeting a kind of literal acknowledgement of their presence. So that's powerful. What you also do, what I love throughout, is speak about integrating it into the fabric of your analysis, and it doesn't seem special pleading or somehow bowing down to the forces, again, of political correctness. You talk about the ways in which, say, Udall is concerned about the Mississippi up in Minnesota, but has no regard for Cancer Alley, that 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi from, Baton Rouge to New Orleans. And you brilliantly write about this in The Great Deluge as well, another classic text from this Brinkleyan mind. So talk to us about race and the environment, because it ain't just a subsection. It's not just a, a small footnote. It's central to determining what happens when peoples of color, when indigenous folk, when black folk, who are related in one sense, seeing the land as oppressive because they were oppressed on the land, but seeing the toxins spilled, the chemicals that are unleashed in the environment, the electric poles that they live near. Talk to us about how you brilliantly integrate that into your story about environmentalism, and it's a central driving force and an engine of your analysis as well.
Man, thank you for recognizing that, because I really made sure I dealt with issues of race and racism in America 1945 to 1973 within my parameters. Look, the reason we were blowing up in Nevada, you can read the government doc, who's going to get sick is just going to be a bunch of indigenous people. Maybe a stray sheep rancher gets in the way, but who are they?
Right.
And the number of poor people, Mexican Americans, and others in Native Americans in Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, getting sick from those tests, it's staggering. But it's much worse. I'm writing about the uranium mining industries and how people around Moab, Utah, didn't care. They wanted uranium out, and they would have workers in, not even wearing masks, anything to protect themselves, no gear. So we created a cancer America where the poor people take on the burden of it. And I really believe that the important voices of it, of environmental justice, there are a lot of great people who believe it. Really, the movement started with the Black Caucus, who's formed in 1971, and I write about that. Ron Dellums out of Oakland is big on it. John Lewis gets a lot of credit. But in my period, I do not underestimate what Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta did. And I just tell you about Chavez out there. He's an interesting guy. I mean, Chavez, I've been dealing with his family and Paul Chavez and all. And of course, Bobby Kennedy famously went with Cesar Chavez when Chavez fasted. What a powerful image that was, running for president, and Bobby Kennedy's breaking the fast with a communion wafer. He did that. He loved Cesar Chavez, and Chavez was quiet in many ways, dignified, didn't give speeches of that were overwhelming. He was in integrity and action. And it's Chavez more than anybody else who's constantly saying, you're making our children sick. We don't have proper sanitation conditions. In ways that are modern in a sad way. And I chose incidences. I picked one in Fort Myers, Florida. I picked Louisiana, Cancer Alley, and I picked Houston, Texas as symbols. You have no idea the industrial waste and contaminants put right on top of where school children are. This stuff becomes more famous in the Carter years with Love Canal and things like that. But I give 3 stories. I mean, they took these for the black community outside of Fort Myers. They sold houses only to African American community, when everybody knew they were atop of a toxic landfill. So 15 years later, the entire community's sick. And yet the people who did the land deal knew it in advance. In Houston, a young man went to a local little, like when you see these industrial little ponds off of buildings, and he went and picked up a styrofoam cup and slipped in the mud and went in the water and was so ill from it, and a whole school protested this environmental injustice of the waste treatment stuff being just raw dumped in poor neighborhoods. And the Houston police, you think Minneapolis was bad, and looking at the entire police came to the campus of a historical black college where kids were protesting, started firing bullets everywhere, ricocheting off. They arrested the college kids protesting for environmental justice, held them up in jail for years. It's called the Holmes Road incident down there. This stuff's buried history. Just like we're talking about Tulsa, race riots, people don't know. If you can find these environmental flash spots, there are hundreds of places like this, that it's a very ripe field for new scholarship in the environmental history world to look at some of these communities. And so when we talk about reparations, I never think of reparations for the Civil War. What about reparations for the people we've made ill since 1945 in all of these places? I mean, and to Udall, to his credit, now Udall was an old-fashioned integrationist. He went after the Washington Redskins, not for their name, but the Redskins would not integrate their football team. Right. As late as '62.
Yeah, latest team.
And he busted that open, and he hired Robert Stanton, who just called me yesterday, who was the first park ranger in the National Park Service. Udall started hiring when he poached to the talent pool out of historically black colleges, but he went Robert Stanton to Grand Teton, 1962, first African-American elevated in the Park Service. And then Bill Clinton put him in charge of the entire Park Service later. So Udall has that in it. He's not a bigot at all, Stuart Udall, but he was insensitive, as white people were back then, to what they were doing. There was white America and everybody else, the other America, and he falls prey to that. Difference of Udall, late in life, he knew what happened in Arizona and New Mexico, and he then takes up the cases of all the downwinders and demands economic recompensation and fights for decades. And he finally gets billions given back to people that those nuclear tests out there did. And he then told me that I have a clear conscience now, because he felt bad as a Southwestern politician. He was promoting the Atomic Energy Commission doing it. Right. And he felt he had made such an utter error as a public servant in the 1950s that at the end of his life he's going to have a reconciliation, and he did it. And that's what makes Udall a cut above most people of that era. And so I think very highly of Stuart Udall as Terror Secretary, and and John F. Kennedy, I think, picked the right guy for that era.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very, very cogent in your book. A couple more things. I know we're winding down. Why is it nearly impossible to instigate what you call for, in the kind of the hope machine, right, as you borrow the term? But why is it impossible to instigate a mass movement around such a devastatingly clear threat, not just to us as a nation, not just to the lived environment, but to the world, right? It's a global thing. We're stuck on CRT, and most people wouldn't know the difference between CRP and OPP, right? I see 5 people listen to 90s hip hop out here. These some hip white folk in Massachusetts, man. Tretch. So, so we get all these, fads that pass through. This is a persistent problem that you have brilliantly, breathtakingly and exhaustively just narrated, the story in this particular era, in this trilogy of your books. But why is it that you don't think? You mentioned Al Gore in passing, and Al Gore, gave it and gives it, so to speak, the old college try. Why hasn't it been able to catch fire, so to speak? And why haven't we been able to really generate mass movement around this most urgent of issues?
A friend of mine from the Boston Globe and I were just talking about this, so it's fresh on my mind. What happened was with that 1973 Arab oil embargo, it sounds light now, but it was a heavy deal. Yeah. And then Nixon's trapped in Watergate. Yeah. And a man named Lewis Powell wrote the famous Powell Memorandum to the Chambers of Commerce saying, we need a counter-revolution to the Rachel Carson revolution. We've had the tables run on us by all these characters. I've named so many different characters they all kind of somehow got together, and now they're creating all of these Clean Air Acts, Clean Water Acts, air quality, go to the Johnson Library and look at the signing pens, We now are in a back position, and we're going to have to spend the next decades coming up with an alternative to save capitalism from the environmental activist because they were worried about their money and they were being demonized. You're the polluter. You're killing the mountain in West Virginia. You're the, And Walter Reuther's plane goes down right after Earth Day, and he dies with his wife in 1970. And the labor union never got in their game again after the unusual death or whatever of Reuther, who should be added in the list of the 60s and 70s with his, he was on a lot of people's enemies list back then. Right. But the labor unions kind of got out of some of that business. But the real thing that happened was that this Powell memo, he goes to the Supreme Court, it lives on. And what Powell was saying is we've got to create the extraction industries or corporate companies. We've got to take over the universities. We've lost. It was a throw in the towel, Powell saying conservatives have been out-hustled here. But we are going to, we need to create new think tanks. Out of the Powell memo is the Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, Core Brothers, the Koch brothers. They're all saying we're going to do everything to stop the hyper-regulation by the federal government of our work. And we're going to have to take control over the school boards at universities. And we're going to have to tenure is going to keep the professors in for a long time, so it might take decades, but we're going to have to do away with them being hotbeds. Ralph Nader going to Boston University, they would be coming out of the rafters, people, for him. Nobody coming to these universities. This is about the biggest crowd. You can't draw big crowds like you could in the 60s and 70s. And they felt, the Powell people, the chamber people felt that the enviros had, the tree huggers and the regulators had taken over the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, and Powell saying we got to create a new media outlet. We have to create our own media. And lo and behold, here we are in 2022, and they've worked. Their counter-revolution ended the environmental movement, but kept it as a rearguard action. And so we're having this sort of battle going on between energy versus environment, the green lobby on the left, the oil, gas, extraction industries on the right, each pouring money into K Street, opera, And now the losers are the American people, and because of the money and the politics, and it's not bipartisan anymore. In my book, I write about a lot of people that, there were Republicans like John Sawyer, Pennsylvania, who fought for the environment and the like. And Gore almost did it with Inconvenient Truth, but if he would have been president, I believe he would have made climate change his priority, climate justice, if you like. Mm-hmm. He didn't win. You had 8 years of Bush, and you had the Iraq War dominant, and then the Great Recession, and we saw what happens in Katrina if you don't have money to get out, and then Obama tried awful hard. He was all about climate. If we forget, along with the Affordable Care Act, it was going to be the green grid. Obama's going to do a interstate everywhere, green charging and solar and da-da-da. He couldn't get traction. And Biden got a climate bill through here, but barely, and we'll see what a Republican Congress starts doing with it coming up. Point is, we haven't had a Rachel Carson moment. We didn't have a catalyst. You would think we've had hundreds when you look at the raging wildfires in California. You know how weird it was for me to be writing about Mariposa Grove, where Theodore Roosevelt camped with John Muir to save the high country, and just watch the flames coming all through California, or watch these Ivan and just what Fort Myers I was talking about, the environmental injustice done to citizens there, building community for colored people back then on an all poisonous land. But Fort Myers just got wiped out. Right. It gets back to Dr. King's, what good does it do to integrate the lunch counter if you're going to have strontium-90? What good does it do to get racial justice in Fort Myers if the whole town is going to get blown away due to shifting winds and problems of the age of climate? The next age, the fourth wave, will come, but it's coming from Gen X. It's coming from young people who care because they are really angry at the baby boomers. They're really angry at mom and dad that we didn't do enough for planetary stewardship, that we were greedy and hogged it all. And they are activists now, and we just saw that in the midterm election. They were underpolled, and I think that generation is going to be the one that sees the change off of fossil fuels and start. And meanwhile, in the environmental justice thing, you have leaders that are doing it. And as I mentioned, your friend John Lewis, I don't think you know how much he did on this issue of environmental justice. It was, we know about Selma. Right. But his second big act was fighting on, and many acts he had, but the environmental justice component was big for him. Why should a people that don't have great economic means have to be the dumping zone and live in squalor and live with the contaminants of our consumer industrial society? And so when you know people like Michael Eric Dyson or John Lewis, it gives you hope. And then Woody Guthrie used to talk about being a hope machine. Right. I mean, I don't want to teach at Rice or you at Vanderbilt, making these young people think they don't have a chance to combat these. Right. But I've seen some young people that, COVID did a number on young people. I've seen young people terrified about climate, and I just say, don't worry that much. It's as bad as you think, but what are you going to do? You can't live don't get ill. That's not helping anybody. Don't have psychological breakdowns over climate and you're reading doomsday scenario. You can start small. You can go work to save a local park. You could organize a cleanup. You can adopt a species if wildlife is your thing. We need people doing beautiful work all over the country, and make sure that if you're a young environmentalist, be healthy. Take care of yourself. We need you and we love you. And be part of the next Rachel Carson revolution, which will either have somebody else's name on it or it'll be known as a generation globally who stepped up, because it's the poor people of the world that are going to be facing the drought, the climate chaos, the dislocation. If you have a lot of money, you're going to be able to move somewhere. But if you're stuck in sub-Saharan Africa, or on the island in the Philippines, your troubled times are coming. Yeah. And so I do worry about it, but I try to stay hopeful, because we must do that.
Yeah. Well, just to piggyback briefly on that before I ask you a final question. So what is the role of social media and all that? We look at the eco-anxiety, that people are trying to shift from eco-anxiety to eco-compassion. So you have these mitigating factors, the personal intervention that allows people to bloom where you planted, so to speak. But is there a noticeable difference in the ability to leverage whatever resources are available on social media to organize, to spread the kind of hopefulness you're speaking about, as opposed to purveying the kind of gross anxiety? And does, you think about Guthrie, you think about Dylan and Smokey Robinson for that matter, but is there any popular culture moments where young people can really kind of get this stuff going?
What a good question on a lot of different levels. That Earth Day was amazing. The musicians and the artists participating in 1970, Joni Mitchell, Pete Seeger took on saving the Hudson River. Yeah. Old Pete Seeger up there on taking his boat, the Clearwater, going. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., built his career doing river keeping out of the abilities to clean up the Hudson. But Marvin Gaye, Mercy Me, The Ecology. I think our pop culture artists can do more on this front, but it's been a moment of, I think the Me Too movement, I think a movement of Black Lives Matter. I think there have been these sort of moments, and I think the environment sort of intersways with it. But I like what Bill McKibben does an awful lot, because McKibben early on got on the internet and said, let's organize in a positive way. In fact, I've learned from people like Bill McKibben's writings and all to keep positive, like have fun. I mean, in my spiritual side, he's actually a man of the cloth. But, I'm Catholic. Raised Catholic, and I have, I've read people like Thomas Merton, the great spiritual Catholic thinker, and I want to keep myself positive and keep, telling young people that make a difference. And I looked at Dr. Albert Schweitzer in this book. I can tell. I mean, I don't think it helps. Schweitzer won the Nobel Prize, went to Africa to take people of modern-day Gabon and take care of people with leprosy. And you know what? In the end, he also had a British colonial attitude, and it's worth criticizing him for that. On the other hand, he spent decades taking care of people with leprosy.
Yeah.
And he wrote a philosophy which he just said, you have to teach a reverence for life, that we have to love the air, the water, the creatures, just in our own daily life, not be so brutal the way that we're treating the planet. We have to live and so all we can do is try to do everyday little things that might allow us right now, and hope that solutions are on the way. It's a longer question than climate, than my book about modern issues of the environment, but I do know that anything can happen if the people demand it. And if you stay positive, believe change can be made, and watch it grow, it'll come out of the medical profession, it's going to come out of scientists, it's going to come out of artists, it's going to come, and it should all kind of rise in a demand. I think it's the problem with climate is it happens this one. Well, was that hurricane really a climate event? Weren't there hurricanes before? Is that melting glacier really a climate? Is this the... And so all these are happening around the planet, but nobody sees it as this one moment, whether it takes a massive the ice floe to break and smash, and meanwhile, energy is a real issue. I wouldn't want to be in the Ukraine this year with hard time getting gasoline, or in Boston, unable to heat our homes. So, we can't be pie in the sky Cassandras about all this, like, oh, well, I'm just a green person and I have a low carbon footprint. I don't like that. I think it's more about awakening and education, teaching in the schools the love of nature and the natural world, and why we're lucky to be on Earth. And I'll end my thing by just saying, when I wrote my book, American Moonshot, about space, I got to interview the astronauts and the NASA people. All of the astronauts thought they were going to the moon. And basically, they all said, it's lifeless. You know it. You get there and you're kicking up dust. And I want to go to the moon. I'm right now, Artemis and the women astronauts going, I'm thrilled. But the astronauts' takeaway was, oh my God, look at Earth. The lonely blue-green planet just floating out there. And we all have to survive and try to remind ourselves just how magical this world is. I mean, I see watching a lizard or a bird or a flower. And if you train to look at some of the things that God has given us in our planet, it's a beautiful and brutal place. But you have to respect it. And sometimes we try to conquer nature instead of living in harmony with it. And that's an educational mindset that's going to have to begin with elementary schools. And the good news is we are starting to teach more and more kids about ecology and nature. There's been a residual effect from the Silent Spring Revolution. And so this new generation, with their laptops, with their understanding of climate, with their wanting to save the planet, I see a new generation of activists unfolding. And you and I can just look on them as grandparents and say, go get them.
No doubt. Well, let's end this grandfather to be on both of our sides here, grandfathers. I want to pull back from all of this to talk about a different environment, a different ecology. You've dealt with the political, the psychological, the moral, the economic, and even the aesthetic. But what about your scholarly ecology? How does Douglas Brinkley write these massive tomes filled with erudition, brimming with incredible research? What's your process? What's your environment? Are you at the crib, by your home, your domicile, by yourself, and like in The Color Purple, you get some food and you throw it out 8 hours later and you're back in there. What do you do? What is Douglas Brinkley's day writing this tremendous book look like? Seriously.
Well, guess what? You know who's sitting in the front row? My wife, Ann Brinkley. She knows better than anybody. Ann, thank you for being here.
Let's have her stand up. Stand up, Ann Brinkley. Stand up, Ann Brinkley. No, you gotta stand up.
Yeah.
So glad you brought your lovely daughter.
Yeah. That one still gets a laugh. You see that one? The nut of it really is, since I was a kid, I've been very blessed that I wanted to be a historian. And also my mom and dad were teachers, and we went all over the United States. So I came up to Cape Cod as a kid, or we went out to Yosemite. We would listen to Detroit Tigers baseball, WJR out of Detroit. We try to find it on any ways we can get it in those days, radio, but I got to go to the Smokies and the Grand Canyon and all. And so for me on these books, to be able to do presidents mixed with environment is just, that's my wheelhouse. But the more, the big thing for me is books. I have them all around me. When I did my doctorate at Georgetown, I moonlit as a night manager of Second Story Books and at Idle Times Books. And I felt the used book business taught me more than the university. I'm something like Walt Whitman saying, the learned astronomer, I look at the stars. But I used to have to price all the rare books and used books. And I worked for a while for the novelist Larry McMurtry, who won a Pulitzer Prize for Lonesome Dove and others. And he was a rare book person. And so some people have golf or movies. I like books. And so it's never worked for me to read. The writing can be hard. The hardest part is getting started. But I'll end by maybe just saying, look, I know this book's long. When you see it out there, you're going to see. Then look at how many footnotes I have. And then look at the back matter. I wanted to show how many national wildlife refuges Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon saved. It's extraordinary. So I easily could lob off 300 pages, but I thought I want this to be a book that people 100 years, 200 years from now, it's all in one place to understand how a generation did this. My publisher would love it if it's 200 pages. I would have saved 200 years, or maybe 2 years certainly of my life by not expanding it. I could have just done John Kennedy died in '63, Rachel Carson, and do it smaller like that, and from a sales point of view, it would have been better. But I was committed that if not me, who? Mentioning Bob Dylan, he has a song called It's Up to Me. He said somebody else could probably write that song, but I'm not hearing anybody write it. I guess it's up for me. I didn't think anybody else would want to weigh in this amount of detail on something that I find so important. And I felt also on this book and all these, you're not going to get this fourth wave climate unless we treat our history of these activists seriously. What I do is introduce people. I'm naming the named ones, but the book has people, Mary Ardeur, who in Denora, Pennsylvania, got sick, and that's where smog was born, went after, lost her job at Harvard, lost her job because she had the temerity to go after the polluters that were making people sick. And at least in this book, I feel some of these people are getting their due in prime time, and that each, by acknowledging them, it might help others. If I'm writing about citizens for clean air in New York City, somebody might read that and say, why don't we create a citizens group like this now? I get letters on the environment from people all over that are in localized fights. John F. Kennedy saved Padre Island, Texas. The sea turtle population's being devastated at Kennedy's Reserve down there. So I'm dealing with the turtle specialist on how the burial, what needs to be done? How do you bring consciousness to that issue? And I like yellow legal pads and a ballpoint pen. I like writing first drafts before things get going. And then the other trick for writers, Sinclair Lewis famously said, the first trick of writing is put the seat of your pants to the seat of the chair. It's blue-collar work writing. It is not a book party. It's just nonstop. The thing is, when your book comes out, you get to go to events like this, and it's like, oh, it'd be fun to be that person. But really, it's like Ann knows, it's just a lot of work daily. And the late writer Hunter Thompson taught me a saying that no pages equals bad day.
Yeah.
You try, it's easy when you're feeling like writing to do your work, but you have to do it some days when you don't feel like doing it and you still need to get column done or 4 or 5 pages done. And that way, journalism's really good because you have a deadline, and that's why a lot of journalists are some of our best historians, because they learned how you must have 2,000 words by Wednesday. You must have, so I try to impose that journalistic ethos on my own self. Today I need to get 5 pages done. I become my own guardrail there.
All right. Amazing. Even at this point, let's give it up for Douglas Brinkley.
Thank you, guys. And thank you, Mike. What a high honor that he came up here to Boston.
Of course. So we got questions. We got Q&A.
Good.
Yeah,
That's
we're
right.
gonna let the audience that knows 90s hip hop so well out here and is interested in Heisenberg and Einstein, but please come to the microphones and ask questions, propose new book projects for Professor Brinkley. Ask him what kind of car he's driving, whatever it is yes, all right. Mm-hmm.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
It's kind of like a two-part thing.
Okay.
First off, the forever chemicals. God knows what's going to happen down the road with those. But on a personal level, and something that we should all see every day, just the garbage that is on the street. How do we get people to have enough sense, instead of throwing a bag in front of a trash bin, put it in the trash bin? And it's not just young people that are doing this. It's older people, and younger people mimic that. So we start off with a negative situation. My question is, and I've been an environmentalist my entire life, and I think I belong to like 15 different organizations, but the thing is how do we honestly get people to take this seriously? Because when you turn on your tap and brown stuff comes out, it's kind of like spooky, you know, to say the least. And then we put a match to it and you blow up your kitchen. That really gets spooky. But how do we get started on this?
Well, obviously, I only could, it's so much. Or maybe, do you want to, well, I'll say this and see if Michael wants to say something.
No.
No. You know, I'm writing in my book about how a state like Oregon decided to do this. You must bring your bottle back. If you bring bottles back, you get 5 cents. There became the recycling movement, you know, of today. Even people are trying to do recycling. With that, and Lady Bird Johnson was talking about what you're talking about, this need for beautification of urban areas, and can we build gardens in neighborhoods instead of junkyards? And so I take your question very seriously. I never like seeing these garbage cans overflow, people throwing their things away. And so, yeah, and that can be community driven. Somebody in Boston could take on keeping, you know, a movement to keep the, you know, a beautification of Boston. We've done a fairly good job in Austin because of Lady Bird with that. Certain cities are better at it than others, but I was recently at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, and I love Purdue. Neil Armstrong went to Purdue, and a lot of the astronauts went to Purdue. But I noticed around the campus where all these young people are just people dropping off like their, you know, their Starbucks cups, throwing them on the ground, and then people don't want to paint their homes that they're leasing to students and all. And it's like, God, you guys can make West Lafayette a lot nicer. If it just, but you can't ask people, dude, you do it. You clean up your block. You lead the thing. And but that's I do admire communities that are able to keep the garbage off the street and keep things clean. And it does bother me when I see those constant overflows that go on garbage recycling, or people just throw it on the ground by the garbage can instead of getting it in it.
And I think just briefly, though, you know, the investment in communities, this is where politics kind of intervenes, or at least intersects with environmentalism, because if you get somebody, you get a neighborhood where you're invested, where you don't leave it alone, where you don't abandon it, where you leave them to their own devices and resources. I think about what happened in Ferguson when the tax base is being, you know, procured by ripping off people through exorbitant forms of taxation through the police department. Then you get a different kind of environmental pressure levied against those people who are there. Or when Robert Moses, you're speaking about him, you know, you lower the bridges so that the inner city folk can't get out to the places and the beaches and so on. I mean, that kind of thing. So the question is powerful, what you have in your own hand, also in what you are inspired to do with your own environment, to love oneself and then love one's environment as well. But that's brilliant what you're saying. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, we have an online question. My students and I have spent some time looking at the 1927 Mississippi flood and its deeply compromised relief, Katrina, and a little bit of Maria. Dyson's formulation, not of natural disaster, but of nature weather event that became an unnatural disaster, has become such useful language. One of the worries we confront is what I think Horowitz in Katrina described as a risk in deeply understanding the dynamics of our unnatural disasters. That risk, if I understand him properly, is the risk that voters become so disillusioned with government failures that voters become cynical and stop asking the government to do anything. Especially in our current climate, what are your thoughts for my students?
Michael, you go for that.
I'll just briefly say, because you'll give the definitive answer. Yeah, that's what Douglas Brinkley is talking about, not giving it up, not surrendering hope. The great theologian and philosopher Howard Thurman, with Boston connections, Boston University, said that, you know, never reduce your dreams or your aspirations to the immediate event you confront, that you come from, say, enslaved people, so that they could never imagine a Barack Obama or Martin Luther King Jr., a Fannie Lou Hamer, but they imagined and conjured in their deepest prayers a different future, and they never gave up, you know. And people who have the most to lose often have the most to win. And so I think remembering that is important. And Thurman finally said, you got a choice. You can be a prisoner of the event, or you can be a prisoner of hope. And I choose to be a prisoner of hope. And as the questioner said, you got to get out there. You tell young people, it didn't turn out the way I wanted to when I voted. Welcome to the real adult world. Stuff doesn't always turn out. Look how they said it was going to be a red wave. I don't know what colors are out here. I have no prejudgment about that. But it didn't turn out the way they said because people got involved and to make a difference. And I think that's what we got to do, which is why your book is so inspiring. But you answer that question, though.
No. And it just on Katrina, I mean, that 1927 flood was a deeply catastrophic, you know, talk about racism on steroids. I mean, they opened up the floodgates to flood the black community to save the white community. And so that's deep in the psyche of black Louisianans, as it should be. So when Katrina hit, and both of us have written about it, there was a lot of feeling that could this have happened again? If they did it in 27, why not in 2005? It wasn't quite that way. It didn't work that way, but the amount of our slow response in Katrina and the lack of services in the communities, for example, poor communities to do evacuation routes, and we could go on and on. There's no way you deal with Katrina without dealing at race and racial injustice. And it's really a fascinating, and that whole area was when I wrote my book, I talked with people. It's a toxic waste site all over there around New Orleans, where for years Texas buries its debris around poor neighborhoods that got washed away, and now parts of New Orleans are shut, Gentilly or East New Orleans. I mean, they're open, but the banks don't want to give homeowners their loans, and they've found a way to shrink So now it's only the wealthier above sea level New Orleans that's doing well, with all the outskirts areas were treated abysmally. So beyond the environment, race is part of everything in America.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, this is a great night, and it's rare that I walk in and listen to two speakers and feel a kinship with both immediately, and then also can, I recognized all the names. That's not always the case, except maybe not all the hip hop. Some. So I have two words that I want to connect. It is the hope. I have the privilege. My career has been working on solutions. I'd love to write books, except I'm too impatient, and I have to work on the thing that's going to fix the problem. And I've therefore raised two kids who have not benefited necessarily materially, but they also have a sense of championship. So the two words, you've mentioned hope. I want to add stewardship, because that's a piece that I think, I could name a whole lot of things that happened during my generation. I won't say all of the boomers, and I'm barely a boomer, but this period of time, I feel like there was a bribe, an unseen bribe that was passed out, where everybody got comfortable. And it wasn't what you heard about in the 50s, because it wasn't, we were too aware to have been that silly. And that comfort is, now we have to break it. And I've got two girls that are busy breaking me all the time. And I'm wondering, they've got stewardship and they've got hope, because they know what we'll work on. But how do we offer that sense of combination of stewardship and hope, i.e. that there's even something to steward, to the generations of humans that we've basically given sacrifice zones. We call them sacrifice zones. I'm tired of hearing, that's one of my, there's so many euphemisms, but that's what they are. How do they feel like there's something we're saving?
Well, there's so much to that. But let me just say one thing to do is start not being so arrogant that the one big idea of the way the country should be, or we deal with issues, is dominant. What I'm suggesting is George Washington Carver, the great, known for Peanuts, he actually is now a model for sustainability and reuse strategies and so Carver, as the ecologist, is not a slight thing. He was because in many ways he was dealing with often how not to waste things for people that didn't have much, sharecroppers, et cetera. He was teaching generation how to reuse this, redo that, but some of his philosophy can be applied to make a little more sustainable living, not be so wasteful. And another example, indigenous peoples, which we were recognized here at the beginning of the program, when you really get down to their views on land water stewardship, say around the Columbia River, and they were right about a lot of the issues. So one of the great things is teaching that now. We don't need just Theodore Roosevelt or John Kennedy and Carson. We can start learning in school about it, how the views of the land ethos or land ethic of Native people, which is many ways much more sustainable driven than the Euro-American idea of just speed, the gospel of efficiency and of saving every nickel for now, and the factories roaring bit. I just gave you those as two examples, but I think there's an opening here for things that we blocked out as being backwards or not ready for prime time. Actually, there's a lot of old folk wisdom that could come up and help us. The Beat Generation poet Gary Snyder, in fact, this sounds pie in the sky, but Gary Snyder's been writing, it's not going to happen, but he's been writing about that state borders make no sense, that our country really should be by environmental eco zones, like from Juneau, Alaska, all the way down to the coast to Carmel, California is really one eco zone. Or Louisiana and East Texas are an eco zone that's similar, where West Texas has nothing to do with that. It has to do with, so you can do more sustainable things if you redrew the map. That's not happening. But he's making you think. He's making, you know, he's a poet, and he's making us think. And then he said, out of all of this nature writing, he's Pulitzer Prize winning poet Gary Snyder was the hero of Jack Kerouac's novel, The Dharma Bums. But he's in the 90s teaching out at California Davis, and he has said, look, here's the simple thing to know, stay together, learn the flowers, and you know, stay together, learn the flowers, meaning know what's around you all the time, and make sure that you are, what you said, a steward. Just try to be a good community steward in all that entails, and you know, things will happen. If your family's worried about, I live here, I'm going to make sure Boston is better. I'm going to find out why those garbage cans are overflowing, as our gentleman said, and just constant. We can be enlightened. We get very set in our ways in a very money-driven world, which it should be. I love our country for that, but we also need to look up for alternatives, Eastern philosophies. Zen Buddha, William O. Douglas, who did all this work at the Supreme Court, went to the Himalayas in 1951 and studied Buddhism. We had a Supreme Court justice doing Buddhist text into our, you know, it doesn't have to just be this one way of growth for growth's sake is good.
Great point. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
We have another online question. With water becoming more and more scarce, what do you think that means for climate activism, and how is this going to change the space in general?
Well, I just would say buy real estate in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, where everybody's been fleeing, and I'm just kind of joking about that in one way, but on the other hand, 100 years from now, there are writers who believe that civilizations should have been built more along the Great Lakes, where you have a freshwater system, and that Phoenix is a mistake. Meaning that in the arid West, building sprawling, a metropolis. You know, the Colorado River has been so overdammed. By the time it gets to Mexico, it's barely a trickle, and we're trying to do all this. That was all done for ranch irrigation and the desert blooms region. Well, that works some places, but not for the vast American West. And so people will eventually move towards water, but the drought situation this past summer in the Midwest was horrendous, and there's no sign of relief coming in the coming years. And so water is, there are many books I like, but there's one a scholar I'll recommend to you named Cynthia Barnett. She wrote a book called Blue Revolution and a book about rain, and she teaches at the University of Florida in Tallahassee. And that university's become a leader in, two universities are doing really well on new ways of thinking environment are University of Florida, public land universities, University of Florida and University of Washington. Oregon State does too. So find some of these schools that are where some of the professors are coming up with new thoughts about how we can, that water is everything. And I begin my book by John F. Kennedy saying our human bodies are, we came from the seas, and our human bodies are 90, whatever it is, 70% water.
No doubt.
Thank you both for being here. Thank you for this insightful conversation. I'd like to ask about Congress, because listening and hearing about this wave of environmental legislation in the early 70s, it's like a greatest hits compilation of environmental legislation. And now just, with each chamber of Congress belonging to a different party in the next cycle, and one party that prioritizes climate change, another party that does not prioritize climate change, it just seems impossible for anything to get done. So to what extent was that wave of environmental legislation because Congress or the federal government, and particularly Congress, was more functional back then? And if that is the case, how do we fix that and get back to that?
I'd like to hear Michael on this too, but I will just say that the media back in that period, which started elevating. Walter Cronkite came in and said, I want the CBS Nightly News and environmental story leading regularly. You won't see that today. And a lot of the great photographers and magazines and started promoting this new environmentalism. So I get disheartened. We were talking earlier, when you see climate so far down, it's like on voter concerns, it's like number 6 or something this past election. And it is a divided world. And I was just mentioning to my friend here, without a bipartisan effort, without having both sides come together, it's going to be hard to do the big new revolution off of fossil fuels. It can't be done by one party. Now, California is trying, and by 2035, they're going to stop. You're not going to be able to allow to buy a vehicle in Washington, in Oregon, and California from 1935 if it's run on gasoline. So their states may be acting more, be able to do more, meaning California doesn't have the gridlock to do that as a blue state, and so they're moving forward. And if they can they're already going to get Washington, Oregon with them, you're looking at a coast, and suddenly automakers are going to say, we've got to start building vehicles that don't use gasoline, because we'll lose that whole market share out there in the West, which is a massive population. So I would look outside of just the federal government, Congress, appropriations for the climate bill, and look at what states are able to do or not do, and you might see that West Coast really coming into the forefront on, as California often does, leads the world in new thinking, and it might be poised to do that again. And what emanates from California could go global.
Yeah, well, for me to briefly, I'm glad for the hopefulness of my colleague here. Thank God for him as a prophet, and I think he's right to shift from the federal to the state, the municipal, the local, especially because self-interest regulates governmental activity and administrative intervention. So if you want to protect what resources you have, then you're going to act based upon those interests. But on the federal scene, we're living with people who are post-science, right? But they ain't even been to science yet. So how you going to be post-science and you ain't took the real science for real yet, right? 2 + 2 = 12. Bro, the algebra got to get redone, right? So you're dealing with people who have challenged facticity, right? And who have challenged the empirical. What's that? A big word that means that which can be falsified or verified through the senses. So now we have people who turn their noses up against science, and look, I'm not here as an uncritical valorizer of science. Read this book and so many other Brinkley books where science has been complicit with horrible and egregious ethical offenses. No question about that. But dadgummit, start there. I'll end by saying, look, if you read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, 2nd edition, and he talks about having a paradigm, and y'all know what a paradigm is. It's a theory about how the world operates. Or if you're poor growing up in Detroit like me, you didn't have a pair of dime, you had a pair of nickels. Thank you, that's better. That's better, people, that's better, right. So you got a paradigm about the way the world operates, you got this theory, and then you have disconfirming evidence. It begins to trickle in, then it begins to accumulate. Then you got a crisis on your hand, Kuhn says, because a crisis of explanation. The theory doesn't fit the data or the evidence. And so what most people do is have a paradigm shift. What the folk we've seen in Congress and in public life of a certain party, of a certain origin, a certain orientation do, is to deny the need for a new paradigm and insist upon data that doesn't exist. And so at that level, I do think that the local will be important, although when you think about the fact that most of these state legislators are the one redrawing maps, so now the power is being shifted to people on the local level who don't want CRT, which ain't nobody teaching CRT in 5th grade. They're just teaching. I'm in Tennessee, in Nashville, and the judge, a conservative white judge, said this is ridiculous. The parents' council came to him and said, Our children are being fostered with this environment of CRT. What is it? They're teaching that there were separate water fountains for black and white people, and isn't that violent? Dude, this is what it was, right? So now the fact is itself up for debate, and no longer, you know, Richard Rorty talked about philosophy as adjudicating competing claims, rival claims about what's true. This is where we got to harken back old school to old school and say, let's sit down, put your seat on the, you know, put your butt in the seat and study. And if we can revive a sense of humane interaction, books like Brinkley, professors like Brinkley, thinking with an open mind, engaging the person as your interlocutor who disagrees with you, but willingly trying to engage in some conversation that leads to difference. If we can do that, then we got a better world. And until that time, keep voting the way we vote to put out the people who don't believe in voting but who want to control the government and who want to control science who don't believe in it. I think that's what we have to do as part of our a contribution to human community. I hope that was Another question? Got another question? Oh, yes, ma'am. Maybe they shut them up. We'll repeat it for you. Eco-travel? Any comments on eco-travel? That's a Douglas Brinkley question.
Well, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think that it's odd that there are people now going to where I've met people, we're going to the Yangtze River while it still exists in China to see it because it won't be there anymore. There are people that'll pay money to go to see a species in the wild before it goes extinct. There's that kind of eco-travel. And which is odd. It's like going to see something before it disappears forever. You know, but I don't know if that was the question. It's been done some good things. I mean, Lawrence Rockefeller, great environmental thinker, philanthropist, Republican. He went and acquired the U.S. parts of the Virgin Island and was able to repair it, so you can go there and visit and have this really kind of a special. You know, national park experience there due to his largesse. But again, the Caribbean's going to get hit very hard here on climate. I mean, are we even going to be able to go do ecotourism to the Virgin Islands with climate change? But I find at its best, ecotourism can help young people if you have the money and ability to go, might get them interested in things. You know, I went up to Buffalo, New York, and what New York does to Niagara Falls, really loathsome. How can the world's most beautiful waterfall be just on the American side treated so horribly? So if a parent's going there to see the falls, the takeaway might be someday in my life I've got to do something, and that is where Love Canal was and the industrial thing. People have just thrown the Niagara Falls into like a dumpster you know, so, but if it's going to Costa Rica and you want to be around parrots and learn about the jungles and you get educated, you know, a lot of good can come out of that.
Well, my echo, that's brilliant, you know. Then I think about Marilyn Monroe and Joseph Cotton there at the Niagara and the devastation. I mean, even capturing the beauty of the environment there on films that are set in these places reveal more about our priorities and interests. But I'll say my latest ecotourism, I guess, given what you said, is to Georgia, where the disappearing possibility of black intelligence in one party and a non-football playing black man in the other is disappearing. So I'm looking forward. I'm going there soon, you know. Let's give it up for the great Douglas Brinkley.
And one last thing, guys. Here's something we could think about as we mingle. What he was saying was so funny, but is there a place in your life that's a Walden Pond? Is there a place in the natural world that you have been inspired by? And I find if I ask people that, they come up with, say it could be some grandmother's farm, or it could be I went to the state park, it could be a rainforest experience. And I think that when you start talking more, it's more fun than you think about places in the natural world that are meaningful to you. And that might be good to do with children or family over Thanksgiving, and have that conversation about places that are holy or special or spoke to you, made your spirit feel uplifted.
The Reverend Dr. Douglas Brinkley. All right.
Bye, guys.
Let's give it up for him, right?